welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to Turn the Page, the podcast of Syosset Library. My name is Barney Levantino, and I am happy today to have with us Don Bentley. Don, welcome back.
Thanks for having me again, Barney.
It's a pleasure. Last time we spoke was, I think, back in around July of 2021, when Target Acquired had come out. And at that time, you were writing in Tom Clancy's universe. And
Yep.
We're here today to talk a little bit more about your own world and Matt Drake. So let's talk about the newest one. The book is Forgotten War, and tell us a little bit about it.
Yeah, so Forgotten War is the fourth book in my Matt Drake series, and I'm lucky enough to have the same editor for both my Matt Drake series and my Tom Clancy series. And his name is also Tom. I apologize. There's always a lot of Toms in this story. And Tom, my editor, said that always likes to say that the difference between a good writer and a great writer is that a great writer pushes himself a little bit more with every book. And so I don't know if he actually believes that or he just tells me that to send me on a mission when I'm writing my next book. But for Forgotten War, since it was the fourth book in the series, when I sat down to write it, there were a couple things I wanted to do. And so the first being Forgotten War centers around my main character, like you said, that's Matt Drake. And Matt has a best friend who goes by the radio call sign of Frodo. And so you see Frodo and Matt together in all of the books. But when in the first book, Without Sanction, Frodo's been catastrophically injured. And so you never get to see them operate together. And so I had this idea for Forgotten War that what if I went back in time and showed one of the first operations that Matt and Frodo were together, because readers really liked them and kind of wanted to see that. And so I did that. And then as I was doing it, I was writing this book in the summer of 2021, which was our the tragic withdrawal from Afghanistan. And so as I'm a veteran of Afghanistan, I did a 1-year combat tour there as an air cavalry troop commander, and it affected me at a visceral level, watching what I had worked for. I just did a year deployment, but I had many friends who did 3 or 4 deployments to Afghanistan. And I know people who have paid the ultimate sacrifice there. And so I was trying to make sense of that, as writers do. And so that came out in the book of Forgotten War. And so while Forgotten War certainly is fictional, many of the events that happened in it are based on actual things that happened in Afghanistan. In all of the conversations between veterans that make up the emotional backbone of Forgotten War are very much actually happened and reflect kind of the conversations I was having. But at its core, Forgotten War is about Matt being willing to do anything to clear the name of his best friend, Frodo, after he's arrested for murder. And what it turns out Matt has to do is to go back to Afghanistan and find the interpreter that worked with them 10 years ago when this murder took place, to figure out what really happened on the day that Frodo was accused of murder.
Your synopsis there raises a couple of points with me and things that I really wanted to touch on in the discussion. And there was one line in the book, which I think was kind of probably a little bit of a throwaway line, but it resonated with me, and I'll try to explain how. And it's a scene where Matt is in a bar and he headbutts a guy. Mm-hmm. And you put the comment in there, it wasn't a Jack Reacher headbutt. And I'm a huge Reacher fan. I'm a fan of Lee Child and Andrew now, who's writing the series. But something was reverberating with me throughout the course of reading it. And I thought a little bit about Reacher's world and Matt's world. And Reacher lives obviously in the real world, but real world events don't ordinarily touch on his adventures, if you would.
Yeah.
He goes about his business. And Lee Child and Andrew write Reacher in just a terrific way. And I'm thinking back now when I spoke to you last time about the constraints on you when you're writing in Clancy's universe.
Yeah.
And now I'm going to talk to you again about constraints where you're taking actual real world events and fitting your story around it. So is the plot driven by what you have in your head first, or is it driven by the real world events into which you put Matt?
Yeah, that is a great question. And I have to preface it by saying I am also a huge Reacher fan. And he, for my money, I think Lee Child writes some of the best fight scenes in the genre. And he does it not being overly technical. There are some on the other side. Brad Taylor's a good friend of mine, and he writes fantastic fight scenes too, but they're very technical. You can tell Brad Taylor was a Delta Force operator and did a lot of combatives. Lee Child's are just visceral. And so it's, a lot of headbutts and knees and stuff, but at the same time, it captures you. And I'm a huge fan of his work. And to answer your question, normally the Matt's world is separate enough. My book before this was Hostile Intent, that had a Russian invasion of Ukraine, and there was I wrote that before it actually happened, and so I've never tried to set a book with actual events before, but the Afghanistan, which all just affected me so profoundly, I thought, I want to use that as the heartbeat or kind of the metronome that's driving the entire book. And it was a very careful line that I walked. And in fact, in my author's notes, I talk a little bit about where I took some liberties. There's some things that are depicted in the book, like the fall of Kabul, the Taliban taking over Bagram, stuff like that actually happened very close together, that I spaced out for kind of dramatic effect in the book, because I wanted to be able to show the reader these constant hits, these body blows that the characters are taking as Afghanistan's falling. In the same token, I wanted to make sure that I paid the respect to the men and women who died, the 13 men and women who died when the suicide bomber exploded their vest. And I knew I had to have that in the book because it's such an important part of that story, but I also wanted to treat it with the respect that it was due. And so it was very constraining, but it was something I did deliberately because I thought that veracity in a fiction novel would just further engross the reader. And I'd pictured them, putting down the book and then researching when did this happen and that happened and such. And so it was certainly a lot harder. And that was part of the way that I pushed the envelope too, personally as a writer, but hopefully it brought something more to the book by doing that.
From my perspective as a reader, it absolutely did. And what came through more so, and again, books in this genre, they're exciting, they're fun to read, there's a lot going on. But here, you talk about the visceral response. And as a reader, I could sense your visceral response to those events. And I could sense that you personally and the people that who experienced it were touched so deeply by these events. And go back a little bit during your time of service over there and the people that and I'm going to set the politics aside right now, because no matter which side you're on, you could point in every different direction and find it all. But could you have envisioned a scenario where 20 years down the road we'd be where we are now?
The short answer is no, and I appreciate you saying that. When I looked at the reviews, or at least that it resonated with you as a reader, because the common theme I keep seeing in the reviews from folks is they mention the heart, that there's heart in this story, that there's an emotional context that maybe you don't always see in this genre. And it absolutely came because of my reaction, because of the reactions I had with fellow vets. And the other, what I take as a compliment as well, is they said, there isn't politics involved in this. There is just a story without pointing fingers. And that's the other thing I try really hard to do, because I think as my son, my oldest child, my son is in college and is going to be commissioned as a Marine Corps officer when he graduates from college. And so he was born shortly after September 11th. And so as a father, the thought that my son a generation later would have to potentially go back to Afghanistan and fight for God knows what at this point, it just filled me with abhorrence. Like I couldn't stand the thought of this being a generational war and the children of 9/11 picking up that mantle 20 something years later. At the same time, and I certainly don't want to say I'm speaking for all Afghanistan veterans, but many of the folks I talked to also just echoed this sense of disbelief that this is how it was ending, that it was, on one hand, I think most Americans and certainly probably most veterans were willing to say, we're ready to be done with this, after 20 years. But it can't be ending this way. This can't be the end of the story. And the other thing that I wasn't expecting, I only served in Afghanistan, but most of the folks, or many of the folks who did serve in Afghanistan, served multiple tours of duty between Afghanistan and Iraq. And Afghanistan was almost like the foundational stone for all of that. And when you chip that away, then the questions I was getting from my friends were, was any of it worth it? Was what we did in Iraq mattered? Has anything that we have done in the last 20 years mattered? And it was just this entire crisis of confidence that this book came out of. And so what I tried to defer back to or fall back to, and hopefully comes through in the book, is the relationships between the men and women who served. And that even if, the question that I got a lot that I was asking myself is, was it worth it? And I still don't know if I know the answer to that. But what I tried to do through the book is show that those relationships that were forged, those bonds, that, brother and sisterhood still stands, even if Afghanistan doesn't anymore.
You're taking, it's like you're reading my note here that I wrote to myself that I wanted to talk to you about, something that comes through really. And it's illustrated between Matt and Frodo, but also between Matt and almost everybody else that he sees along the way. This bond that forms between the people that were there serving together, and whether they were serving literally together or figuratively. That bond between the combatants, if you would, I guess is the word, is just, it comes through so strongly. And the note that I put to myself here is you have people who share this bond, and looking at the sequence of events, the word that I wrote down is a sense of bewilderment that must course through that whole fraternity in terms of how did we end up here after everything that we did back then.
Yeah, that is absolutely the case. And then the other, it's funny as I'm texting my friends back and forth and saying, again, the duality of what you're feeling on one hand is, okay, at least we're done. And then on the other hand is, by God, it can't be done this way. And could I still do something about it? And I was, one of the ones who Googled flights to Kabul and was texting with an old comrade in arms and saying, are there still helicopters there? And he's like, yeah, there's MD-500s, and here's where we put the rockets. And for me, it never got past the point of texts and kind of having a conversation with my wife to see what she would say. But there were men and women who went beyond that. And that's the crazy thing about this story too, is I don't think maybe since Dunkirk has there been an effort where civilians stepped up. Many of them served before, certainly, but most of them were out of uniform and went and honored the pledge that they made to fellow comrades in arms who happened to be Afghans. And and that's the other part of it too. I tried to treat that with the respect it did well, but like the men and women who were part of the Pineapple Express that, started originally with literally Green Berets who were sitting at home on their computer trying to help interpreters and comrades in arms, move around the Taliban. And you just, on one hand, you're like, we are the most powerful nation probably in the history of the world. and we're watching all of this go sideways, and it just hurts your heart. And then at the same time, it brings tears of pride to your eyes to watch men and women step up and say, it's not going to happen on my watch. You're not going to get left behind. You know, people, Tim Kennedy has a great book called Scars and Stripes, where and at the end of it, he talks about going to Afghanistan. And it was literally many of them with no plan, with nothing ever than, I think I can help. And I thought, you know, that has to be part of the book too. And I don't want that to take away from, I'm quite certain there were many brave things done by people in uniform that we don't know about yet and might not know about for a long time. But man, by God, I had to tell that story too. And that again was driven by that, like, I can't believe I'm sitting here and there's nothing that I can do. And some people took that a step further, and that became part of the book. Not
so much simply there's something that I think I can do to help. What comes through is this, I have to try to help.
Yes.
This sense of obligation to try to help. And I don't want to I want to circle back a little bit to Matt and the book itself, which is a really exciting story. And I don't want people to think that the whole book is just going to get bogged down in the details of the extraction and all. From a straight thriller perspective, it's really a fun read, and it's interesting. And it's interesting also watching Matt work this time, where he's kind of out more on his own than he has been in the past, without the rigid support structure that he would usually rely on. And that's also a little bit of a different take on his approach.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was interesting as I was writing it, because there's the question of the murder that drives the beginning of the book, is kind of the linchpin all through the book, and you really don't understand what happened until the very end. And while that was fictional, part of that was something from a conversation I took from a very dear friend who was in the special operations community, who kind of laid out something that happened and the repercussions of that. And so I took it and twisted it because you can't let the truth stand in the way of a good story. But it was also, you know, at the beginning, as I was writing it, it almost had to feel more of a whodunit, because you have a crime that happens, and then the witnesses to those crimes, which were the team of men who operated with Matt and Frodo 10 years ago, start dying under mysterious circumstances and stuff. And so it was almost like, as I was writing that, I was trying to figure out, what kind of book is this, and is it so far different from what I've done before? And I think, you know, one of the things when you're writing a series of books is that you can fall back into, okay, and so at this point in the book is where Matt calls for help from this person, and so I really tried to push that and to push Matt beyond his traditional combat multipliers, or the traditional people he goes for help. And Afghanistan just helped me do that, again, because I was watching, as we talked about before, men and women without a safety net, without even the sanction of the U.S. government, go and risk it all and try and evacuate people. And so that really became this story. So even though Matt Drake is a case officer for the Defense Intelligence Agency, this very much became a personal quest for him. And I think that some of that reflects the personal nature of the subject matter to me, certainly.
Yeah, it all comes through. As I said, the your own attachment and your own experiences really come through. And to circle back again, you talked about how your editor said the difference between a good writer and a great writer is pushing yourself. Maybe the difference between a good editor and a great editor is pushing the writer to go beyond that. So maybe you give your editor a little credit, kind of for giving you the nudge in that direction as well.
Absolutely.
It really is an enjoyable read. And we kind of got to a little bit of a Robert Frost moment towards the end there, where there's a little bit of a fork in the road, possibly from Matt. And I'm anxious to see the next installment and see which of the roads he ends up taking.
Yeah, I think one of my favorite writers, period, and certainly in this genre, is Daniel Silva. And what he does that a lot, we talked about Lee Child and Jack Reacher before, and And Lee Child is a fantastic writer, but Reacher as a character doesn't really change a whole lot. He continues to do Reacher stuff, and it's fabulous. But that's what Lee has decided to do with that character. Daniel Silva had made, or either decided to, or has had his character change over the series, and everything from getting married to having kids to going from a cast off of the Mossad to now being the director of the Mossad and stuff. And so it's hard to do that, but it also, I think, gives the series a feeling of freshness where the reader said, hey, I still get to tune in every Tuesday for my favorite characters, but it doesn't feel episodic. It feels like it could go a different direction. And so as I was writing Forgotten War, and it became apparent that this was something that Matt was going to have to do outside the bonds of the U.S. government, I really leaned into that and said, how does that affect him afterwards? Because there's certainly a sense of betrayal there, and that he had to do it. And what does this mean for Matt afterwards? And so you're right, there is a kind of a fork in the road there, and I'm kind of anxious to see which path he picks too.
You're not quite sure you're set yourself yet, but it's certainly it's something I will certainly look forward to. The book again is Forgotten War. It is on so many levels a really, really good read, just as a straight thriller, as an action book, as a commentary on the bravery and the fortitude of the people that serve in our military during and after their service. It really is. It comes through all across the way. And Don, thank you so much for joining us today. And I'm going to mark my calendar for the next one that comes out. I'm going to track you down, and we'll talk about see where Matt is at that point.
I would love that. Thanks so much for having me. I always enjoy talking to you.
Thanks so much, and good luck with this one. And we will look down the road for the next.
Sounds good.
Okay, that's it for this episode of Turn the Page, and we will see you all down the road as well. Thank you for joining us today.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.